In the dark and treacherous world of the Middle Ages, power was measured exclusively by brute force, the steel of swords, and the possession of impregnable stone castles. Wealth was synonymous with physical gold and vast expanses of land, heavy elements, dangerous to transport, and easy to be plundered by enemy armies or highway bandits. However, in the midst of this feudal chaos, where the borders of Western civilization were fractured by incessant wars of religion, an absolutely astonishing economic phenomenon occurred. A group of marginalized and exiled individuals, locked in the dark confines of the European ghettos, began to exchange incalculable fortunes without moving a single gold coin. Why did abstract credit and international finance flourish precisely where rigid Roman laws failed miserably? Official history has taught us that modern capitalism was born in the tall glass towers of the industrial age. But anthropological records and sacred texts reveal a much deeper and disturbing truth. The answer is hidden in an ancient legal code that allowed the invention of impersonal commerce across the most hostile borders of humanity. Today, we unearth one of the greatest secrets of civilization. Welcome to the investigation of how the science of the ghetto and the structure of the Talmud laid the unshakable foundations of global capitalism. To understand the true magnitude of this economic and intellectual revolution, we must immerse ourselves deeply in the brutal dynamics of power, geography, and the socio-political stagnation that defined the Middle Ages. After the definitive collapse of the hegemony of the Roman Empire in the year 476 of the Common Era, the European continent plunged into what historians often call the Dark Ages. The continent fragmented into hundreds of isolated principalities, duchies, and feudal kingdoms. Long-distance trade practically disappeared, paralyzed by the insecurity of land routes and piracy on the seas. In this environment, the economy regressed to a primitive agrarian barter system. Land became the only true source of wealth, and social mobility became petrified. In parallel, the world was divided into two immense spheres of influence, irreconcilable and perpetually at war: the European Christian world and the vast Islamic empire that extended from the Iberian Peninsula to the borders of India. The commercial laws inherited from Roman law required the physical presence of goods and people for an exchange to be legal and valid. Roman law was brilliant for administering a unified empire, but it became completely useless and obsolete in a fractured world where crossing a border meant risking one's life, and where a Christian merchant had no legal guarantees or protection in Muslim lands, and vice versa. In the midst of this immense geopolitical paralysis, there was a stateless people, the Jewish diaspora. After the destruction of the Second Temple of Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era, and their subsequent massive exile, the Jews found themselves dispersed simultaneously across 3 continents. They had lost their physical territory, their army, and their center of worship. But, in exchange, they had executed the most brilliant socio-political survival maneuver of antiquity. They consolidated an invisible and unshakable government through an encyclopedic legal code known as the Talmud. This sacred text was not simply a compendium of prayers or religious mysticism. It was, in empirical practice, a colossal manual of social engineering and international jurisprudence. While the vast majority of European peasants and nobles of the early Middle Ages were mired in absolute illiteracy, Talmudic law had instituted compulsory and free universal education for all male children of their community 1,000 years before the European continent even dreamed of the concept of public schooling. This transformed the Jewish communities of the diaspora into islands of literacy and abstract knowledge. In the dark confines of the ghettos, to which they would later be confined by papal and royal decree, these individuals became the true universal citizens of their time. They were the only ones who possessed the linguistic and intellectual training to translate and keep burning the torch of Greek science and sophisticated Arab medicine, acting as an irreplaceable intellectual bridge between the East and the West. The ghetto, designed by medieval rulers as a prison of physical segregation and social marginalization, paradoxically operated as a hyperbaric pressure chamber. It forced the community to direct all its energy inward, developing a scientific, educational, and, above all, economic laboratory of unprecedented complexity in the history of humanity. The historical bond and anthropological revelation of this era are concentrated in a thesis as controversial as it is fascinating, popularized at the beginning of the 20th century of the Common Era by the eminent German sociologist and economist Werner Sombart. In investigating the origins of the modern economic system, Sombart argued that capitalism did not grow organically from Christian feudalism or the Protestant ethic, but that it was structured and catalyzed by the Jewish people during their long exile in the Middle Ages. The main conflict lay in how to overcome the physical limitations of trade in an era of violence and absolute distrust. How could a merchant in the city of Córdoba send an immense fortune to buy spices from a merchant in the city of Baghdad or Damascus without caravans of gold being intercepted, stolen, or confiscated by corrupt princes or Saracen pirates on the long journey? The answer lay in the profound operating system of the portable country. The solution did not require armies or warships. It required an intellectual abstraction. The Jews used the fourth section of the Talmud, known as Nezikin, or the section of damages, as a standardized and mathematically precise international mercantile code. This immense body of jurisprudence regulated down to the smallest detail commercial liabilities, partnerships, joint venture contracts, property law, real estate, and the absolute inviolability of legal oaths. Because the Babylonian academies and rabbinical courts functioned as an international Supreme Court network through their epistolatory system known as the Responsa. The Jews formed a network of trust based on voluntary consent and internal religious discipline. This network surpassed any geopolitical border. Thus was born the greatest economic innovation of the Middle Ages: impersonal commerce and negotiable securities. By having a unified legal code that was respected both in the kingdom of the Franks and in the courts of the Umayyad sultans, Jewish merchants were able to invent and popularize the use of letters of credit, promissory notes, and payment orders. A Jew in Paris could deposit his gold coins in the hands of a local money changer of his community. In exchange, he received a coded piece of paper. Then he traveled light and without physical wealth through territories plagued by bandits, crossed the hostile enemy lines of the Christian and Islamic worlds, and, upon arriving in Cairo, presented that same piece of paper to another Jewish money changer, who honored the debt and handed him the equivalent gold based purely on trust and the terror of social excommunication dictated by the Talmud. This paper represented the revolutionary transformation of material wealth into abstract wealth. The ghetto, far from destroying their agency, endowed them with an impersonal legal structure that allowed long-distance credit when the rest of the world and primitive Roman laws required the transfer of physical gold. Sombart discovered that international finance, maritime insurance to protect commercial fleets against shipwrecks, and the embryonary concepts of corporate shares emerged not out of greed, but out of the imperative and absolute anthropological need of a landless minority that had to mobilize its capital in the form of information and written promises to avoid the constant plundering by their oppressors. The pinnacle of this vast anthropological and intellectual evolution is the realization of how this invisible network of trust irrevocably altered the course of Western history and propelled humanity toward modernity. As the European continent began to awaken from its feudal lethargy toward the 14th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, the nascent nation-states, ambitious princes, kings seeking to consolidate standing armies, and even the popes of Rome themselves in their colossal architectural projects faced an insurmountable obstacle. They desperately needed liquid capital to finance the expansion of their empires, their routes of maritime exploration, and their endless military campaigns. However, the European nobility had its wealth immobilized in sterile lands, and the Church strictly prohibited the charging of interest under the sin of usury. It was in this systemic and institutional vacuum that the commercial science of the ghetto proved to be indispensable. Jewish money changers and merchants, armed with the impeccable portability of Talmudic law and their vast network of international liquidity, acted as the economic and cultural lubricant that set the gears of the Renaissance in motion. They provided the necessary funds for monarchs to build modern states, structured large-scale loans, and facilitated the flow of luxury goods from the exotic lands of the East to the cold palaces of the West. The supreme revelation of this historical phenomenon is that capitalism, before becoming a cold financial mechanism of investment banks or gigantic anonymous corporations, was in its origins an intellectual and immensely humanistic feat. It was the desperate act of survival of an exiled people who, refusing to perish under the boot of intolerance and lacking the protection of Roman territorial laws, had to invent a portable homeland founded on abstract knowledge, the ethics of contracts, and the unshakable sanctity of the written word. The modern individual and the contemporary free market were not born in imperial courts, nor in the stock exchanges of the 19th century of the Common Era, but in the dark and suffocating alleys of medieval ghettos. They were born in the precise instant when studious and persecuted minds managed to transmute the dense gold of the earth into the pure and eternal abstraction of human legal trust. Archaeology, sociology, and the critical study of sacred texts demonstrate to us irrefutably that the greatest innovations of civilization often arise on the margins of oppression, forged by those whom official history tried to silence. The science of the ghetto proves to us how the human need for survival managed to transmute a religious code of study into the structural basis of the world economy and modern capitalism. Now, the crucial and moral question is for you. In our current hyper-connected financial era dominated by impersonal algorithms, do you believe we have lost the ethical trust and human backing that originally made this abstract system of commercial exchange possible? I invite you to leave your deepest arguments and generate a rigorous debate in the comments section. If you value this level of intellectual demand, historical depth, and academic rigor, do not forget to subscribe to our channel and support the video with a like. This is part of our series Chronicles of Thought. Until the next chapter on our channel, Jewish History, Evidence and Truth.